Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. We appreciate it. And since it is Veterans Day weekend, we also want to take a minute and thank any of you who might be veterans for your service. We do appreciate it. I know our speaker is definitely a veteran, and some of you in the audience may be, and some of you who are watching this on video maybe as well. So thank you for your service. And we feel like this is an appropriate talk to have this weekend. And we are very happy to have with us Ken Robison. And I'm going to read this because it's a quote. So radio journalist John Arneson said of today's speaker, "For some reason, whenever I interview Montana author Ken Robison, I end up calling him, quote, a true Montana jewel. I never go into the interview intentionally meaning to say it, but listening to his stories and all, it just comes out. His tireless research continues, and how he unearths gems of the past is truly remarkable. As he told us on Voices of Montana, it comes down to a lot of research. There is no substitute for long hours of study and travel looking for the best stories possible." So Ken is a Montana native. He now lives in Great Falls, where he's affiliated with both the Cascade County Preservation Commission and the Overholser Research Center in Fort Benton. He has now authored 8 books and contributed to another 4, and he's already got one more in the works. Today he's going to tell us about his latest book, which is Montanans and the Great War, Open Warfare Over There. So Ken, thank you very much.
Thanks, Kirby. Thank you, Kirby. I'm honored to be here. Thank you all for coming in the middle of a Cats Grizz. At least they aren't playing each other today. That would really be a dilemma. This crazy image I wanted to share with you, it's compliments of Wallace D Coburn, and of course the Circle C Ranch fame is really well known around Montana. Wallace was once described as a blue-eyed, stalwart, laughter-loving lad with a face like a Galway blazer and a smile that's worth going miles to see. Horseman of the plains, mighty hunter, rancher, cowpuncher, scholar, wit, and poet, he rounds out his career as a Westerner by being the only white chief of the Assiniboine Sioux, his tribal name being Petakuakahonga, which means cowboy chief. So what better way to start our talk about World War I, among the wildest and certainly the greatest events in our history. In many ways, the Great War shaped the 20th century and certainly had a tremendous influence on all the men and women of Montana and the other states. 1 year ago, I brought out my first book on Montana and World War I. And I did it because even though you can read bits and pieces of what Montanans did during World War I, and you can read the hundreds and thousands of books out on World War I to learn about different aspects of the war, no one had really tied Montanans directly into the war, and especially the role of women. Now, there's good work by Ed Saunders of Laurel and a few others, but I wanted to bring out a book that talked about what was going on in the local communities, what was going on nationally, what was going on overseas, and certainly this was a world war. So that first book covers the year 1917, and that year was a blur of activity, mobilizing the country, passing draft legislation, building 16 massive training camps, including Camp Lewis near today's Tacoma in the north for Northwest draftees, organizing food production and credit for the Allies. After all, we couldn't provide fighting men for them from the very beginning in 1917, but we could provide food and credit in large quantities. And this was a time when many new roles were opening up for women in industry, in the rail repair yards in Great Falls. The Great Northern started hiring women virtually weeks after the draft began to take effect in the summer of 1917. And this had been true in Britain throughout the war, and of course I think the American leadership knew it would happen here, and it certainly did. Many, many roles opened up for women in industry. But there were also many roles that opened up in the military that had not been there in previous wars, where really, except for nurses, women did not serve. In this war, I'll be talking about several that had some pretty fascinating roles. But sadly, this was also a time, and it accelerated in amazing fashion during 1917, when the nation was cracking down on every form of dissent, as patriotism was building into hyper-patriotism. And this was especially difficult as a period for German and Austria-Hungarian Empire immigrants. In the midst of all this, Montana was providing vital minerals like copper in the face of labor strife, wheat in the first year of a multi-year drought that was about to set in, and frontier-hardened men and women in greater numbers because of a grievous census miscalculation. A greater number of Montanans served in percentage of our population than any other state. So my first book went through all that and went into the ending in March of 1918, the end of the first year that we were in the war. We had built the training camps, we had the draftees in hundreds of thousands, and by March of 1918, about 500,000 Yanks were in the American Expeditionary Force in France. And this was beginning to show on the battlefield. Now in my new book, I pick up with the rest of this powerful story. And the Great War continued with fury in the spring of 1918 as more Americans and more Montanans began to play a role. My book begins with the dramatic days in late March and April, and actually continues for almost a 3-month period, when the German High Command launched a massive spring offensive. And their intent was to smash the British forces, drive them into the North Sea in the Flanders and Belgium area, and defeat the German, overwhelm the French lines and capture Paris. Their estimate was that the French would withdraw from the war if the Germans could just capture Paris. Heavily reinforced by millions of German soldiers that had been on the Eastern Front in 1914, 15, 16, and even early 1917, fighting Russians, the huge Russian army. Well, the Russian army had gone through 2 revolutions. The first had been in the spring of 1917, when a social democrat government formed and deposed the Tsar. And this government, led by several, including Kerensky, was determined to form a democracy, but they were also determined to continue the war with their allies and defeat the Germans. Well, by the fall of 1917, the Bolsheviks had been able to gain enough power that they seized control of Moscow and the central part of Russia, and a civil war actually continued for about 3 or 4 years in all of the fringes, North Russia, the Far East, in Vladivostok and that area, and in the Caucasus. So Russia was in turmoil, but the Bolsheviks had control of the main Russian army, and they sued for peace with the Germans and withdrew from the war. This allowed, as I just mentioned, hundreds of thousands, actually up to 3 million German soldiers to be shifted to the Western Front, and that was the heart and intent of the German High Command. The U.S. still didn't have enough forces on the battlefields to tip the balance, so it became a race against time. Just for perspective, I've assembled an outline of France and Belgium with Montana in the background to give you some perspective. I mean, any of you that have traveled in Europe know basically how small it is when we hear of a high school team from one part of Montana having to travel over 700 miles to play another team, as happened last weekend. And when we look at this, we see the dimensions. For instance, the German lines were only, the Marne River was only about 38 miles from Paris, and we'll be talking about how critical it was to hold that line when the German offensive reached the Marne. You'll join Montanans as they engage in the first major offensive battle at Cantigny, a day to remember in history. You'll join Montana Marines in the bloodiest day in their history as they earned the nickname Devil Dogs by charging through hell on earth at Belleau Wood. You'll be on the front line as Montanans of the 3rd Division helped blunt the vital German surge toward Paris, saving Paris that day in July 1918 and earning the eternal gratitude of our French allies and earning the honored name for the 3rd Division of the Rock of the Marne. You'll find yourself behind German lines with Montanans in the Lost Battalion of the Statue of Liberty 77th Division facing death at every moment. You'll follow Montanans of the 91st Wild West Division as they storm out of their trenches over the top, charging into open warfare as they're under their battle cry, Powder River, let her buck, as it echoed through the Argonne Forest. I might add a couple of words about my subtitle, Open Warfare Over There. From General Pershing's arrival in France in June of 1917, he had 2 strategic tenets that he would not compromise. First, that his American Expeditionary Force would fight as American divisions and corps, not as replacements in French and British divisions and corps. So they would fight as American units. And second, he would not let his American Expeditionary Forces get bogged down for extended periods in trench warfare, as World War I had been going through for the years of 1914 to early 1917, where hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides were suffered to gain a few kilometers of territory. One other, I think, very important element to understand is that Montana provided 2 major units to the war. The first being the 2nd Montana, the National Guard right here from Fort William Henry Harrison, and then an infantry division of draftees formed at Camp Lewis. That division was the 91st Wild West Division, and both groups used that battle cry, Powder River, let her buck. The National Guard was mobilized as soon as we declared war, and they formed the 163rd Infantry Regiment. On their arrival in France around Christmas of 1917, they were assigned to the 41st Division. That 41st Division, called the Sunset Division, and it was a good name because it did not fight as a division. It became, in its own right, a replacement division, sending small or large groups of trained soldiers to each of the other divisions that were fighting and beginning to fight in France, like the 1st Division, that the Big Red One that had gone over with General Pershing in June of 1917 and that had gained the most combat experience. Its regiments, like the 16th and 18th Infantry, were loaded with Montanans, as were really every other division that came to France had large numbers of Montanans. And for that reason, I mean, it was a shame that the National Guard didn't get, the 163rd didn't get to fight as an integral unit. But what that meant was that Montanans were spread through all of the divisions and in on all of the action. Every battle had a substantial number of Montanans, and it would not have happened if they hadn't been farmed out to all these other divisions. When I launched the book a few weeks ago in Great Falls, the audience insisted that I pin down my favorite story from the book. Well, if you've seen my first book, or some of you I'm sure have maybe even read it, you know that what I'm doing is capturing the stories of Montana's men and women that participated in their words. And so the stories that I use in this book are the same way. And in this case, I had to admit that my favorite was by this nurse, Alice Cannon. I don't unfortunately have a photo of her, so I'm using her service record, which is all too brief. But to flesh that out, she was one of 10 Montana women to serve in the Navy as nurses in World War I, and she was the only one that was sent overseas. Most of the Navy bases, or the Navy bases as well as hospitals, were on the East and West Coast, so most of the doctors, nurses, and facilities were there. But there was one big base at Leith, Scotland, and Alice Cannon, Nurse Cannon from Lewistown, was assigned to that. And for my purposes, thank goodness she was, because she, the very minute that censorship was off and they could write home what they were really doing and insight into their real story, she wrote a fantastic letter that I use in the book. She talked about so many fascinating things, including the end of the war, being present for the visit right after the war of the King and Queen of Britain, the influenza pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu then sweeping Europe and America, the dramatic surrender of the German fleet at Scapa Flow, which was actually visible from her hospital and from that part of northern Edinburgh, Scotland. Nurse Cannon later transferred to the Navy Hospital at Brest when her hospital at Leith, Scotland, was closed in December of 1918, and she continued to serve for many more months until she came back to the U.S. in 1919. After returning to Lewistown for an extended visit with family and friends, she moved to Los Angeles, and from there, through the rest of her life, she served in the hospital in Los Angeles. And I'll quote a bit of her letter. "So many wonderful things have happened lately, I hardly know where to begin to tell you about them all. But guess the first one should be Peace Day, that wonderful day that came on so suddenly that we can't even quite realize that it's true yet. I can imagine how people at home took it, the noise, excitement, crowds, but not so here. As you probably know, the people are very undemonstrative here. They took the war as a matter of course, a burden that had to be borne, and there was no grumbling or complaining about it. They paid the price and kept still. So now with peace, they don't take it in a spirit of pride or vainglory in what they've accomplished, but rather in a spirit of prayer and thanksgiving that it's finally over and they can have their loved ones home, those that are able to come back. So we find them slipping off to church to pray. Of course, there was a crowd downtown that evening, some noise, drunks, singing and dancing on the streets, but nothing like you'd expect. Several days later, the really big event happened, the surrender of the German Navy, right out in front of our hospital. It was foggier we could have seen the whole thing. As it was, the fog lifted for about an hour at noon, and we did see the ships. 4 of our doctors had the rare pleasure of going out on the USS New York and seeing the whole thing. They said it was perfectly wonderful. The British fleet, led by our 5 battleships, the New York, Texas, Florida, Arkansas, and Wyoming, went out to the mouth of the Forth, this is the Firth of Forth, and formed 2 parallel lines 6 miles apart, then prepared for actions, guns loaded, gas mask on, etc. At the appointed time, the German ships appeared over the horizon, flying the German flag and the white one of surrender. They seemed to be coming from all directions at once, then formed into 4 lines and sailed in between our 2 lines. They were then searched, and at sundown their flag was lowered, never to be up again unless so ordered. Theirs the humiliation, ours the glory. But who can say they did not deserve it and more? They never could pay, no, not in a century, for all they had done. So that's the kind of letter that Alice Cannon wrote, and there are other parts as well. Throughout the books, Montana's men and women tell their stories in their words. This is true, and bring out so many acts of bravery on the battlefield, captured so dramatically in their words throughout my book, yet none match the brilliance of reporting of Floyd Gibbons of the Chicago Tribune. 16 years after the end of the war, the Fort Benton Women's Club was meeting, and they were giving their impressions of the leading newspaper correspondents of World War I, thinking back. They talked about Will Rogers, Walter Lippmann, and others. Mrs. Beulah Overholzer, the wife of the River Press weekly newspaper editor, talked about the Chicago Tribune war correspondent Floyd Gibbons, who'd won prominence through war service as well as his newspaper reporting. In fact, Floyd Gibbons was in the field of battle on Bloody Thursday, June 6th, when the U.S. Marine Brigade first assaulted the seemingly impregnable Belleau Wood, and Gibbons almost died that day with many of the Marines he accompanied, including many Montanans. 2 days later, as the fight for the wood still raged on, Gibbons, though badly wounded, survived operations on his arm, head, and the loss of his left eye. As he lay in his hospital bed, he listened to the latest reports from the battlefield and wove them into his experiences on the field of battle at Belleau Wood and filed a report. Gibbons began his story with words that would raise Marine heroism into legend, the day the devil dogs were born. And he wrote, "I have a new ideal today. I've found it in the Bois de Belleau. A small platoon line of Marines lay on their faces and bellies under the trees at the edge of a wheat field. 200 yards across the flat field, the enemy was located in the trees. I peered into the trees, but could see nothing, yet I knew that every leaf in the foliage screened scores of German machine guns that swept the field with lead. The bullets nipped the tops of the young wheat and ripped the bark from the trunks of the trees 3 feet from the ground on which the Marines lay. The minute for the Marine advance was approaching. An old gunnery sergeant commanding the platoon in the absence of the lieutenant who'd been shot and was out of the fight. This old sergeant was a Marine veteran. His cheeks were bronzed with the wind and the sun of the 7 seas. The service bar across his left breast showed that he had fought in the Philippines, in Santo Domingo, in the walls of Peking, and in the streets of Veracruz. As the moment for the advance arrived, he arose from the trees first and jumped out onto the exposed edge of that field, then ran with lead, across which he and his men were to charge. Then he turned to give the charge order to the men of his platoons, his mates, the men he loved. he said, "Come on, you sons of a bitches, do you want to live forever?" Pretty powerful. So Correspondent Gibbons, wounded, entered this American Red Cross hospital at Neuilly, which was on the north outskirts of Paris, to have his serious wounds treated. This was the largest American hospital in France, and who should happen to be serving there and perhaps even helped Floyd Gibbons, but Fort Benton's Florence Nightingale, in Jack Lepley's words, Virginia Flanagan, and she was serving at the Neuilly Hospital. Her diary's at the History Museum in Great Falls, and I have just a portion of it in my book, but she wrote, "We had air raids every moonlit night, and the Big Berthas boomed constantly. Some nights all the lights would have to be put out, and on such nights we carried lanterns with petticoats on them so we could visit the wounded, seriously injured patients and check for bleeding. The night nurse's dining room was in the basement, down a long stairway, and sometimes the lights would go out while we were on our way down. Often by the time the lights came on, the horse meat was cold. We had French ladies who were volunteers, and they came to help at night. At about 10:30, they would make themselves comfortable with blankets in wheelchairs, and if there was an air raid, they would get up and hold the hands of the best-looking French soldiers. But they were really very nice ladies, and after all, were volunteers. One night I was awakened by what sounded like cannon and looked out the window, and all the sky was red. I woke up my roommates and told them that there must be a big battle close by, but they only laughed at me. However, when we got up in the morning, the courtyard was filled with stretchers of wounded from a fierce battle at Chateau Thierry. I took this photo at the Montana State Agricultural Museum in Fort Benton. Jack Lepley put it together with an authentic, it's an original Chrysler Field hospital that somehow he got hold of. And it's a very nice tribute to the nurses from World War I. So many Montanans served in so many divisions, as I mentioned. Even a division like the 77th Statue of Liberty Division, originally composed only of inner city street kids from New York and Brooklyn. Well, it had hundreds and hundreds of Montanans. In early October 1918, the 77th Infantry was heavily involved in the assault on Argonne Forest with the 91st Wild West Division and many other divisions. 9 depleted companies of the 77th with 554 men under Major Whittlesey advanced so rapidly that the American Expeditionary Forces and French units on their right and left flanks stalled and lost contact with them. Those companies, with about a quarter of the men in them being Montanans, were not lost, the so-called Lost Battalion. After all, they knew, and the Germans certainly knew, right where they were. But rather, they were cut off and surrounded by the enemy. For 6 desperate days, they fought on. Despite great odds, Major Whittlesey simply refused to surrender his dwindling force. At least 23 Montanans were killed, 1 was captured and died in captivity, and many more were wounded. I found the accounts of 2 Montanans that had been with the Lost Battalion, Private James Irwin of Billings and Private Marvin Long of Glasgow. Time doesn't permit reading now, but Private Irwin's account is in my book. This image shows the remarkable lone pigeon, Bon Ami, and the importance of that pigeon was they had a flock of pigeons with them for carrier pigeon purposes, And they didn't need it to let people know their location. I mean, the Germans knew it, and the Americans knew generally where they were. But the problem was the French artillery kept firing on their position, and they kept trying to send, Whittlesey kept trying to send pigeons, carrier pigeons back, telling them to get the fire to stop. And the Germans were shooting the pigeons down about as fast as they could be launched. Little Mon Ami made it through the lines, carried the message, the firing stopped, and although, it still was a very high casualty rate, at least it helped, and Mon Ami was quite the hero. While the action overseas was accelerating across the nation and in Montana, total war was the theme. 24-year-old Frank Morger of Fort Benton joined hundreds of Montana men called up in August of 1918 for service in a new program in the Student Army Training Corps, SATC, in colleges around the nation. In Frank's case, he was sent to the University of Montana, although there were others being sent to Bozeman and also to Montana Tech, where the program was beginning. The SAT program was designed for colleges to train draftees in trades needed for the war effort, as well as to train a pool of officers for the Army. That sure sounds like a Reserve Officer Training Corps, and it certainly was the beginning under an early name. It was jointly administered by the military and the university, and the students took part in academic learning while also training to become soldiers. Here they're practicing trench warfare on the campus at the University of Montana. Throughout this period of intense combat, during the summer and fall of 1918, Open Warfare Over There presents stories from the home front, fascinating and little-known stories about the way Charlie and Nancy Russell participated in this great war, how Jeanette Rankin, Montana's congresswoman, was fighting to be elected in a new office. She was shut out of running for re-election to Congress, and so she determined to try to be elected to the Senate. And that is quite a story because the Anaconda Company was fighting her all the way, and eventually she was unable to gain election as the first American woman senator. You'll learn about legendary Montana Senator Mike Mansfield as a tough kid who went from the mean streets of New York to the not quite so mean, but still fairly mean streets of Great Falls, Montana. Every time I go over to the University of Montana campus, I go over to that statue of Marine and Mike Mansfield located right outside the Marine and Mike Mansfield library. And it's a very powerful reminder of how early he was in the military, but how powerful he became in politics later. And I tell his story in the book. Michael, as almost an orphan, arrived in Great Falls in 1910, a 7-year-old tough guy, hard to control and quick with his fists. And for 7 tempestuous years, young Mike was in and out of Great Falls public schools and jails and orphans' homes. As the U.S. entered World War I, he rode the rails to Oregon and managed to join up with an Oregon unit that was being sent overseas, and he hid on the train with them, or they hid him on the train as they went over to New York for them to be shipped out. Here he managed to manipulate his birth certificate, and his father was crippled and badly injured in a construction accident, which is why he'd had to give up the kids and send them to Montana. But his father was still in New York and was able to write an authorization, and between the revised birth date, making him 17, and his father's letter, he was able to join the Navy as a 14-year-old. 14-year-old Mike Mansfield was on the USS Minneapolis in combat in the North Atlantic, escorting ships, troop ships. As to Charlie Russell, there's a lot about, he did just kind of a continuing stream of benefit things. One of the biggest was painting 2 watercolors that became used in the Food Administration posters. Food was big, as I mentioned earlier, and as you can imagine, and Herbert Hoover had earlier received acclaim as head of the Belgium Relief Organization before we got in the war. Now he took over as the food czar, the food administrator. With no pay, he organized in an almost miraculous fashion. He energized the entire nation because he made the food program appear to be voluntary when in fact it really wasn't, but it was very carefully crafted. And part of that was a very intensive poster campaign. And the two Charlie Russells, the first one, this is just a newspaper, black and white of the first painting. And Charlie, of course, had to send not only humorous letters when he submitted the paintings to the Food Administration, but also poems. And this one's called Hooverizing. I hate to take your grub, old hoss, but then I'm leaving meat and wheat to fighting men. And by you handing in your oats to me, the both of us is Hooverizing. See, we're squaring up with Uncle Sam, our friend, just kinder helping hold the easy end. And then he went on to provide a second one. This is the actual color painting of Meat Makes Fighters. And with his painting, he sent this little poem. If I can get it out of here. I ain't a-wearing khaki 'cause I'm too old a stag, but I'm handin' beef and hide to them that holds the flag. Pie and cake is good when folks just feed for fun, but beef and leather plenty puts men behind the gun. This is my 5th book with the History Press of Charleston, South Carolina, and one of the things I like most about them is the fact that they allow me to provide a lot of photos. They insist on high quality, and they give me a lot of say in positioning the photos. For instance, the 4 photos on the front cover, the first one being the Marne, the scene from the Battle Marne, you can imagine. And what I was able to find was young Montanans like Daniel Griffin of Teton County, who wrote dramatically of the actions of his 9th Machine Gun Battalion of that 3rd Division in stopping the advance of 2 German divisions across the Marne River. And the second image is this young native nurse in the bottom left, Louise Lafournais, whose story I tell in the book. Louise, amazing story. We don't have time to talk a lot about her, but let me just say today she would belong to the Little Shell tribe. She was not considered a federally enrolled tribal member back in 1917 when she went into the Army, and so she's been kind of overlooked. But Nicholas Vroman assured me that she would have been a Little Shell today, and they're nearing federal recognition. Anyway, somehow this young native nurse got her nursing degree. She not only got the nursing degree and served at the Columbus Hospital in Great Falls and also the sanitarium in Fort Benton, but she also proved up a homestead, and she was quite young. I think she was 24 years old when she went in the Army and served very well over in France. The third image is African American up in the upper left. Horace Bivens, an amazing story. Again, we don't have time to do it justice, but the book does. He was a Buffalo soldier during the Frontier War days, and was a master sergeant by the end of his career. He had set marksmanship records in the Army that stood for a good many years. Buffalo Bill had tried to recruit him for his Wild West show, but Horace would not leave the Army. He had, by the time of World War I, had retired and was operating a small truck garden on the outskirts of Billings, but he immediately volunteered to go back on active duty, and the Army was very anxious for that to happen and offered him a captain's rank. He'd been a master sergeant in the Frontier Army, a captain's rank, and all he had to do was go over to Liberia and raise a 100,000-man army and take them to France. Well, I think maybe because of his age and it sounded overwhelming, he deferred from that, but they gave him this was the segregated army, so they gave him a colored supply unit in New Jersey, and he ran it very well throughout World War I. The final one is on the bottom right, and you probably can't tell from there, and he's a much younger guy, but that's George Patton, and he's standing beside a light French tank. George Patton, Captain Patton first, and later promoted to colonel, was given the task of organizing a tank corps. The U.S. entered the World War I with virtually no Air Force, certainly no tank corps, and when our troops would go into battle, the French tanks and French flamethrowers and French aircraft would all be in support until we were able to organize. And so Patton went to work, and I found one young Montanan. There were several that served with him, but one in particular wrote some great letters back about serving under Patton in the brand new tank corps. It was a young man, Lawrence Vidal from Great Falls, and so through Lawrence Vidal, we tell the story of Patton's organizing of the tank corps. Last fall, oops, I guess I'm going the wrong way. Oh, come on. Okay, last fall I was at the Rocky Mountain Museum of Military History about this time. In fact, it was on Veterans Day, and Hayes O'Toole, I can never pronounce his name. Hayes, anyway, has this amazing collection of World War I equipment, memorabilia, and so on. Hayes had that same model light French tank as Patton was standing beside. There were only 3 of them in the U.S., according to Hayes, his and 2 that are in museums. So I was able to crawl inside that tank. It was quite an experience. Finally, on Charlie Russell, let me say that there was an exhibit at Great Falls about a year and a half ago as the 100th anniversary centennial of World War I began, that was showing a small World War I display. And it was small because Charlie Russell deferred, as I mentioned. He didn't know the guys in khaki, and he didn't want to paint World War I scenes. He knew the Indian Wars soldiers, and he knew the Native Americans, and that's what he painted. Well, he did, in fact, paint 2 World War I battle scenes. One was in that exhibit I mentioned, and it was part of an illustrated letter. In fact, here's the letter. And I have put that on the back cover of my book with the permission of the anonymous owner. He was very kind to let me use both the image on the back cover and then the letter inside the book, along with my translation of Charlie's writing. Of course, the war ended. Greatest headline I found in Montana is this Great Falls Leader headline. Leader was an afternoon paper, sold on the streets by the kids, and they had to make the headlines friendly for the kids out hawking the papers. And the Leader traditionally had the greatest headlines because they crafted them so the kids could use them on the streets. Well, this was the headline for the armistice. And of course, there are two of the Viskesny Spirit of America Doughboys statues in Montana that went up after the war. The one at Columbia Falls at the Montana Veterans Home, and the one in Fort Benton. Missoula's got a very fine statue by a different artist. And I'll end with this, and that is that I found so much good material. For instance, over 4,000 Montana casualties that I didn't have the word limit. It wasn't a 600 or 800 page book that the history press allows me to publish. And so what I've done is create a website that if you go to my kenrobisonhistory.com and click on World War I, that'll take you to a link that has augmented footnotes. It has the casualties, the 4,000 casualties, and other material. And I reference those in the footnotes. So it's going to be interesting to see how well it works, because if I have a word limit, let's say maybe 60,000 words in a book, I have probably 30,000 words here with the full letter when Lawrence Vidal was writing a detailed letter on the new tank corps, and I could only use a few paragraphs, the best paragraphs. And so spread through these PDF files are many, many more words to augment what's in the book. With that, I'll close and be glad to answer any questions. And I should say this is one example. This is the footnote on listing all the Native Americans that I found. And the research was a real challenge in this book because no one had ever, Ed Sanders, I should say, has done amazing research with the women that were nurses and in other roles. And so I didn't have the benefit of his book when I was doing it, so I did that. But the ethnic groups, how many Chinese served from Montana in World War I? Well, I found 13 that did. How many African Americans? Well, no one had ever assembled the comprehensive list. I know there were 198. I've been able to find about 182. Some of them were sailors. I have a problem with that because the enlistment card you saw up there for Virginia Flanagan, for the Army, it always recorded race. For the Navy, it didn't record race because the Navy had been integrated since the Revolutionary War. Now, it didn't mean that they gave all the best jobs to African Americans. That was a problem in the Navy, but they didn't record race. So, and the same way with Native Americans, only the full blood, let's use their term, recorded on the enlistment cards. The others recorded as, quote, white. So there's Jerome Kennerly, who was on who went into the Atlantic Ocean when the transport Tuscania was sunk, and he was fortunately saved. 10 Montanans were not, but 90 were of the 100 that were on board that ship. Jerome Kennerly, I happen to know because of fur trade days, the Kennerlys, the Weatherwaxes. I mean, I know the fur trade names. And when you started looking at the different tribal participants in the war and trying to identify them, I've got it up to about 180. There was a list that informally the Montana Historical Society, someone had assembled here that had about 70. I've extended it by about 100, but it's been a lot of fun researching, and it's open-ended. There are more African Americans than I found, a few more. There, I'm sure, a lot more Native Americans than I found, and so on. So anyway, any questions? Yes?
You said a high percentage of Montanans, from a miscalculation of what our quota was in Montana. How many casualties? What was the percentages?
Well, about 40,000 a little over 40,000 Montanans served. Not quite half of those, however, were in a training stage, because by November 1918, the Army in Europe was up to 2 million, but there were another 2 million in the training camps that would have gone over if the Germans had not surrendered. The census miscalculation was based on use of Census Bureau estimates for each state in 1917. And they estimated, the US Census Bureau estimated that Montana had 950,000 people, which was patently absurd. We in fact had somewhere around 500, maybe as many as 550,000. And of course, this was the middle of the homestead boom, and they were extending that out, I think, and had gotten carried away. So Montana had at least 25% more serving than in percentage of population than any other state. And just a simple example, I compared how many blacks served from the state of Washington, where there were 3 times as many blacks, African Americans, in the population as in Montana, and yet it was 198 in Montana and 166 in Washington state. So, I mean, every ethnicity was serving at a higher percentage because the population had been so inflated. Any other? Well, thank you all very much.